So good morning, Professor Pippin. I'll start with a rather general question. Is there any sense in the study of Hegel today? How can one avoid reducing the study of Hegel to a mere historical and philological curiosity? And what are the questions that Hegel could still help us answer today?
Yeah, thank you. That's a very large question. The first question, perhaps, is practical. That is, if you're a graduate student studying Hegel, what hope do you have of finding an audience in the world and a job? So the first thing to say is that the situation in the last 40 years has improved dramatically. Hegel's reputation fell into nothingness, really, for two reasons, in the Anglophone-speaking world especially. One was the attack on Hegel by the founders of analytic philosophy, by Russell and Moore. And he never, in the Anglophone tradition, really recovered from that attack. And the second was the Second World War convinced many people that Germany must have, in its intellectual tradition, a dark side, an anti-Enlightenment, irrationalist, romantic side. And Hegel was taken as the epitome of this anti-Enlightenment, anti-liberal, anti-individualist, collectivist dark side. And then philosophically, the interest of Anglophone philosophy and even philosophy in other countries shifted pretty dramatically away from Hegel's concerns. So the first point is things are much better now for a number of reasons, partly having to do with things like Charles Taylor's book in 1975 and various other important books that reestablished Hegel's reputation. But the interesting part of your question is philosophical, not just practical. And the philosophical dimensions, I think, are the advantages of Hegel's philosophy for contemporary study are numerous. One is that he is the first philosopher to give to philosophy a historically diagnostic task. The famous phrase is, philosophy is its own time comprehended in thought. And that for anyone who is a serious philosopher, Bernard Williams, I think, is the most prominent proponent of this, has to take the history of philosophy seriously. That is, has to take the idea that philosophy has a history and that history is connected to the history of the world. It's not just self-enclosed in the academic tradition of philosophy. And therefore, part of the actual living task of philosophy is to figure out what's happening to us today in terms of the rationality of our institutions and the justifiability of our practices, but in a way that isn't just a comparison of them with some Platonic ideal of perfection, but takes seriously the radically historical nature of human life. In political terms, Hegel also enjoyed a kind of resurgence with the so-called communitarian movement, relatively superficial movement philosophically, but it manifested a kind of dissatisfaction with the standard options of liberal democratic political theory, the atomic individualism of liberal democratic contractual theories of state authority began to seem to some people quite justifiably, I think, inadequate. That it didn't provide a picture of a collective life that had much meaning or substance to it. And then there are many other things one can say. Hegel was one of the first to question the continuing vitality of art in a modern commercial liberal democratic republic. And that has proven to be very prophetic for the fate of art in the post-19th century world. And then, as I was saying yesterday in the discussion of the talk, something about the Enlightenment conception of what there is to know took its bearings in the 16th and 17th century, essentially from the new modern natural science. And Hegel provides a way of arguing that non-living nature could perhaps best be explained mechanistically or in terms of Newtonian physics, but that there was a deep metaphysical problem with explaining all organic or living life, living being, anything alive, by the standards necessary to explain inanimate nature. So Hegel became one of the first philosophers to kind of suggest a way back to Aristotle, back to a conception of explanation that wasn't restricted to modern natural science, and to give it a kind of philosophical credibility. Aristotle's reputation had disappeared thanks to the attacks of Hobbes and Descartes, people like that. And Hegel was the little nod to Leibniz, basically the first modern philosopher to attempt a resurrection of Aristotle, especially by concentrating on the appropriateness of Aristotle for organic life and especially for the human form of life. So, I mean, one could go on, but I think the prospects for Hegel's being an important philosopher to consider for contemporary life has never been greater in my lifetime. 40 years ago it was very different. Studying Hegel was like studying Madame Savonarola or pataphysics or something like that, but that's completely changed, I think.
Thank you very much. So you spoke about understanding our time under the shape of thought, and for most European scholars this goes through making history of ideas and not only working with concepts. And so I wanted to ask you, in the past 2 decades, American philosophy has shown a growing interest in Hegel and in many other authors from the continental tradition. As a reaction to this, several attempts were made on the European scholarship side in order to understand the American tradition within a unified and homogeneous thread of historical and conceptual development. Instead, we read in Herbert Schneider, A History of American Philosophy. In America, at least, it is useless to seek a native tradition, for even our most genteel traditions are saturated with foreign inspirations. What is your stance with reference to this position? And given the possibility of a difference in the American perception of what tradition is, could one still talk of one American tradition, or would it be more accurate to consider an intertwining of several ones? And even more generally, is there any sense in talking about this issue? Do you think it any useful?
Well, there are philosophers whom I respect a great deal who do try to argue for an essentially American tradition in philosophy. One is Stanley Cavell. In a way, that's his life's work. And resurrecting the ideas of Thoreau and Emerson especially as equal to the ideas of Heidegger, for example, in their world historical importance. The other was Richard Rorty, who essentially concentrated on the pragmatic tradition as a uniquely American tradition. Rorty used to insist to me constantly that there was no need to read Hegel. Hegel was too difficult, and you could get everything you needed from Hegel from Dewey. So we should just read Dewey. But at the end of his life, right before he died, he changed his mind, and he wrote a very nice review of one of my books saying, okay, I give up. You can't get everything out of Dewey, you have to read Hegel. Pippin is right. But the question itself is a very, very complicated one. It's hard for me to say because I have always been, since I was a very young student, always much more interested in the European tradition. It seemed to me that philosophy in the neo-Kantian and then in the post-Fregean analytic tradition had limited the question of what philosophy should discuss too narrowly. And the major influence here was Kant, and people took it for granted that Kant had shown that what there was to know could only be known by modern natural science, and that what there couldn't be known by modern natural science had to be approached, to generally say, practically. But I always thought that one of the things, this is another point Cavell makes, Kant claimed that there are things we cannot know, but that we cannot doubt. And he meant really the realm of the moral and to some extent the realm of the aesthetic. And most people took that to mean that we were doomed to a kind of ignorance about what we needed to know. But Cavell suggests that the point Kant was trying to make was that our relationship to some of the concepts, the notions, the issues we need to have some relation to are not relations of knowledge. They're other relations. So I think in the post-Kantian tradition in Europe, the idea that philosophy could still be about meaning and value, how things like blocks of marble or a printed page or moving human bodies mean what they mean, and the question of the value of those activities could still be raised, even if they couldn't be raised within the domain of modern natural science. So I've been always much more interested in Schopenhauer, in Nietzsche, in Heidegger, in the critical theory tradition, and so forth. But in the United States, it's a very pragmatic country, and the influence of science and the philosophy of science and clear, concise, manageable philosophy has always been overwhelming. So I do think there is an American tradition in philosophy, similar somewhat to the neo-Kantian moment in Germany, very skeptical, comes from England, so maybe it's not purely American, very skeptical about claims to know that transcend basically empirical science and the mathematical foundations of empirical science. But I think, as you say in your question, that's changing as the, in a way, unsatisfactoriness of what academic philosophy has become begins to be somewhat more evident. I mean, academic philosophy is in a funny position because it's become so highly specialized that the very best people who do it, if they get academic employment at, say, a large state university, they're asked to teach not their specialty, but the grand history of the philosophical tradition for which they're unprepared. So there's a kind of disconnect between what students want in philosophy and what highly trained, deeply specialized philosophers in America are prepared to teach. And that's creating a kind of pressure to open philosophy up to a wider range of questions. I mean, this process is slowing because of the financial crisis of universities and the in a way, almost the closing of various philosophy departments, and they're turning them into service courses for the rest of the university. So this is a very complicated problem. But I think the American tradition, even though it's a distinct tradition, pragmatist, skeptical, very practical tradition, is gradually responding to a certain kind of pressure building because of general dissatisfaction with the super highly specialized and monodisciplinary nature of American philosophy.
Thank you very much. You probably have partially answered already, but I wanted to ask something specifically on the Hegel Renaissance that we had in the last 20 years. It was suggested that the renewed interest in Hegel that interest America in the latest years has been an expedient to recover from a standstill of analytic philosophy. And I wanted to ask you if you think that it really is just this thing, or if we have some other reasons, or it's just part of the whole truth, or it's just something completely different which brought back attention to Hegel.
Yeah, well, that's a complicated question. The first Hegel revival after the Second World War occurred in Germany. It occurred in basically Heidelberg from the mid-60s through the end of the basically 1980s. When I think under the pressure of the student generation of the 60s and an interest in Marx and a radical critique of capitalism, the interest in Europe in general, but especially in Germany, shifted to the basic, deepest foundations of a Marxian critique of modern capitalism and the role of philosophy in providing both the critique and the foundations for the critique in, let's say, first philosophy or metaphysics or something like that. So the so-called Heidelberger Schule, the people in Heidelberg in the 60s, began a kind of interest that spread throughout Germany, and then there were a lot of American students like me who read the work of Dieter Henrich and Fulde and Teunissen and the famous figures from the Heidelberg days, eventually Rüdiger Bübner and their students like Rolf Horstmann. Those were the people I got my Hegel from, not the standard American commentaries on Hegel, which I didn't find very interesting. And there were a lot of students like me who got interested in Hegel because of the new scholarship and philosophy being produced, primarily led by Dieter Henrich during the 60s and 70s. That was extremely important. And then Charles Taylor plays a very important role in the United States. So Wittgenstein's investigations were published in 1953. And Taylor was at Oxford getting his doctorate with Isaiah Berlin and came under the influence of this book, as well as the influence of people like Elizabeth Anscombe and eventually Philippa Foot. And a neo-Aristotelian movement in moral theory began to take hold. And neo-Aristotelianism is very close to Hegelianism. So Taylor published this book, Hegel, and it was important for, in a way, political reasons. Here, by this point, by the mid-70s, he was an Oxford Don. And he was very well known for his first book, Explanation in Human Behavior. And this book was a standard book in analytic philosophy, criticizing the natural scientific mode of explanation when applied to human conduct. And because he was so well known as in a way, registered, upstanding, analytic philosopher, this huge book on Hegel made a big impact, made it more respectable. And then in the 80s and 90s, various works started to appear that argued that the kind of Hegel that was attacked in Anglophone philosophy was not Hegel, that he was not a theological metaphysician, but that his position had a rich array of contemporary, quite interesting philosophical positions to defend. And people like Wilfrid Sellars began to teach Hegel at places like Yale and Pittsburgh. And people like Rorty began to be influential about the bearing of European philosophy on American philosophy, and their students like Brandom began to teach seminars in Hegel. And gradually, as the picture of what Hegel was all about changed, the attractiveness of Hegel for analytic philosophy students who wanted some more systematic philosophy. I mean, Sellars said that philosophy at its highest is about how things, in the most general sense of that term, all hang together in the most general sense of that term. And if that's your interest, Hegel's your person. So Sellars and the Pittsburgh School began to play a larger role. And I think a lot of it is driven by a need from some more systematic account of the totality of human life, not just the part of it studied by the modern natural sciences, but that there's some more sweeping kind of significance that we need to give to what we're about than can be given by those sciences. But all these different elements played a crucial role, I think, in the development of the new Hegelianism.
Thank you very much. So I was asking about the past of the Hegel Renaissance. Now I'm going to ask something about the future or the development. For the European audience, the Hegel Renaissance in the English-speaking world has marked a turning point in the history of American philosophy, as you also just reminded. On the one hand, contributions on Hegel by prominent American philosophers have become a necessary step for all European students that are interested in the topic. On the other, nevertheless, the Hegel Renaissance has been frozen in its original methods and issues, mainly concerning the highly discussed question of whether Hegel was a metaphysical thinker or not. So I wanted to ask you if, after almost 20 years from the outbreak of the Hegel Renaissance, this very question could still be considered vital and characterizing the Hegel Renaissance, or in general the understanding of Hegel by American philosophy, or if this scenario has evolved and developed dynamically over these 20 years, and there's something more relevant that European scholars should turn to.
Yeah. Well, there are two things to say. One is, of course, Hegel is a metaphysical thinker. He has a theory of what freedom is. He has a theory of what agency is. He has a theory of how the world has to look for it to be able to make sense. The claim that was so decisive was that Hegel was not a metaphysician in the tradition of rationalist dogmatism, modern rationalist dogmatism, where philosophy is about supersensible entities knowable by pure reason alone, monads, substance, and so forth. It was assumed that Hegel that he had a theory of the unreality of all of this and the reality of an underlying spiritual substance that manifested all of this. When that picture was attacked, it became clear that Hegel could be approached in a number of very different ways. So the so-called non-metaphysical reading of Hegel is limited to the demonstration that the theological substance monism view of Hegel, the one that was the object of so much criticism, was incorrect to the text, that it did not properly appreciate Hegel's inheritance from Kant. He's not a Kantian, but it's very clear in the logic that he thinks Kant has ended the tradition of rationalist metaphysics in the modern period. That doesn't affect whether his metaphysics is Aristotelian. I'm trying to argue that his metaphysics is Aristotelian and perfectly compatible with the modern world. So I think this freeing of Hegel from this set of assumptions about the kind of metaphysics he did has meant that a more contemporary Hegel has been able to emerge. But I feel compelled to say one shouldn't overestimate the Hegel revival in the United States or even in Europe. It is still very dangerous career-wise for a good student at a top graduate school to write a dissertation on on Hegel. I mean, America is very hard to describe briefly in academic terms, but we have many different kinds of universities. And the goal of every serious, good student is to reach a so-called R1 research university. The top 15 universities where you teach graduate students, you have a teaching load that respects the need for research, you get sufficient time off, and you have very good students. That's the dream. But there are like almost 5,000 different colleges, universities, community colleges, and so forth. And at the top elite universities in the United States, with the exception of Pittsburgh, to some extent Harvard, to some extent Chicago, to a large extent Chicago, apart from those universities, there is no one seriously doing research on Hegel at almost all of the other universities, or if there is, there's just one. So the situation is much better than it was 20 or 30 or 40 years ago. But it is not the case that there is now widespread acceptance of Hegel in the analytic community. The analytic community is itself very balkanized. Part of it is regional. There's East Coast, Midwest. Bizarre that this should be and West Coast versions of philosophy. And there are little camps and schools in all of them, very few of them with any interest in German philosophy. So I think it's important. And I think in Germany, too, the situation has changed enormously since the 1970s. And most advanced German graduate students are not working on the German tradition. Maybe a little bit on Kant, but they're interested, as I think you indicated earlier, a lot in analytic philosophy, or what is called analytic philosophy. I never really pay attention to those distinctions. But the situation is nowhere near like a broad acceptance of Hegel's seriousness as a philosopher. Quite the contrary. He's still, in a way, kind of under siege and suspicion almost everywhere that there is a serious academic philosophy department.
Okay, thank you very much. I think we're done. Thank you very much, Professor Pippin.
I hope that was good.